We've looked at many major and systematic efforts to address inequality between women and men, both in general and in development cooperation and in agriculture. Since the 19th century, if you count the women's suffrage movement, and since the 1960s, if you think about second wave feminism and the lead up to the 1980 World Conference on Women in Mexico City and all the work that followed from it. I'm going to structure my talk with a focus on examples from development cooperation and agriculture, and this is sort of the general outline of the approach. In my view, the most helpful way to think about this is as a mystery or a puzzle. At every stage, we've made progress in efforts for gender equality, but insufficient progress. And after decades of effort, we're clearer about the dimensions of gender equality, and we're closer to understanding, but not yet to one-size-fits-all solutions. So let's turn to unpacking this complex issue. What have we learned along the way, and what are the questions that we will invite you to help unpack? I want to begin by sharing a brief video that encapsulates the approach I'm using.
Do you ever feel completely overwhelmed when you're faced with a complex problem? Well, I hope to change that in less than 3 minutes. So I hope to convince you that complex doesn't always equal complicated. So for me, a well-crafted baguette fresh out of the oven is complex. But a curry, onion, green olive, poppy cheese bread is complicated. I'm an ecologist and I study complexity. I love complexity. And I study that in the natural world, the interconnectedness of species. So here's a food web or a map of feeding links between species that live in alpine lakes in the mountains of California. And this is what happens to that food web when it's stocked with non-native fish that never lived there before. All the grayed out species disappear. Some are actually on the brink of extinction. And lakes with fish have more mosquitoes, even though they eat them. These effects are all unanticipated, and yet we're discovering they're predictable. So I want to share with you a couple key insights about complexity we're learning from studying nature that maybe are applicable to other problems. First is the simple power of good visualization tools to help untangle complexity and just encourage you to ask questions you didn't think of before. For example, you could plot the flow of carbon through corporate supply chains in a corporate ecosystem, or the interconnections of habitat patches for endangered species in Yosemite National Park. The next thing is that if you want to predict the effect of one species on another, if you focus on only that link and then you black box the rest, it's actually less predictable than if you step back, consider the entire system, all the species, all the links, and from that place, hone in on the sphere of influence that matters most. And we're discovering with our research that's often very local to the node you care about, within 1 or 2 degrees. So the more you step back, embrace complexity, the better chance you have of finding simple answers, and it's often different than the simple answer that you started with. So let's switch gears and look at a really complex problem, courtesy of the US government. This is a diagram of the US counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It was front page of the New York Times a couple months ago, instantly ridiculed by the media for being so crazy complicated. And the stated goal was to increase popular support for the Afghan government. Clearly a complex problem, but is it complicated? Well, when I saw this in front page of the Times, I thought, great, finally something I can relate to. You know, I can sink my teeth into this. So let's do it. So here you go, for the first time ever, a world premiere view of this spaghetti diagram as an ordered network. The circled node is the one we're trying to influence, popular support for the government. And so now we can look 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees away from that node and eliminate like 3/4 of the diagram outside that sphere of influence. Within that sphere, most of those nodes are not actionable, like the harshness of the terrain, and a very small minority are actual military actions. Most are nonviolent, and they fall into 2 broad categories: active engagement with ethnic rivalries and religious beliefs, and fair, transparent economic development and provisioning of services. I don't know about this, but this is what I can decipher from this diagram in 24 seconds. When you see a diagram like this, I don't want you to be afraid. I want you to be excited. I want you to be relieved, because simple answers may emerge. We're discovering in nature that simplicity often lies on the other side of complexity. So for any problem, the more you can zoom out and embrace complexity, the better chance you have of zooming in on the simple details that matter most. Thank you.
In the 1970s, a number of women scientists began to document that women were being systematically excluded from participating in the modernization of agricultural systems. Here are just 3 examples of researchers whose work documented the cost of that exclusion. And I particularly want to point to Esther Boserup, whose main claim to fame is that she challenged Malthus. You remember Malthus said, if we keep on increasing the populations, we're going to run out of food and it's going to be a total disaster. And Esther said, no, wait a minute. Actually, as we have growing populations, we have the ability to increase food production as well, which may mean that the original Malthus equation was flawed. Another example of complexity and the possibility of causal relations not being simple, but in fact influencing each other. And the third one, of course, is Kate Cloud. Essentially, while women were instructed in nutrition and family hygiene, agricultural knowledge and investment was for men. Even though in most societies, women had major responsibilities for particular crops or for particular parts of the production system. Let me give you 2 examples. The first one is the efforts to produce modern chickens in a modern way. In the 60s and early 70s, a lot of effort in this area was directed toward men, when traditionally chickens had been kept by women and children. And what happened? Well, of course, the chickens died because the men had no experience, no interest. It was seen as women's work. Another example was early irrigated rice production in West Africa, where traditionally rain-fed rice was the job of women, and women kept the income from it. The first major projects to produce irrigated rice in West Africa targeted men as the landowners, men as being instructed in production technology, and yet when it was time to grow the rice, the men expected the women to actually do the work. Not only did the women have no training in producing these new varieties of rice, but in addition, they had no income from the rice because the income was transferred from them to the men. As a consequence, many of them left the irrigated farms and the project failed. Hopefully we know better now. Both historically, within societies and between societies, the systems of gender relations are different and change over time. This picture is from the changing of the family law in Morocco. If you just think about your life as a man or a woman and how different it is from your grandfathers or grandmothers, gender relations are an important part of any society or culture, so important that they are very deeply embedded and taken as natural. Very few of us wake up in the morning and wonder whether we're men or women. We've learned that from the day we were born or even before. We know historically that periods of peace and prosperity coincide with periods when gender relations are more equal. This is another example of complex causality. We don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg, but we know that they coincide. And the 2 rationales on the following slide give you an example of why that is the case. Most people now agree with both of these rationales for why gender equality is a good thing. The rights-based rationale and the instrumentalist rationale. But it's important to be aware that they lead to different implementation strategies. If you're using an instrumentalist rationale, it can, for example, lead to a greater work burden for women. And if women don't benefit from that work, as in the case of the irrigated rice example, They may not continue the work, or other crucial work may be neglected, with unforeseeable negative consequences like poorer health and education outcomes for family members. Before we get into a more detailed analysis of what we've learned about strategies, I wanted to make sure that we have a common understanding about what we mean by gender equality. In these images, the one on the left shows equal treatment but inequitable outcomes. The middle picture shows adaptation to ensure equal outcomes, but it's still within the same system of standing on boxes. The right-hand picture shows equal outcomes, but the system for getting there is quite different and easier for all to use, although it may have some unintended consequences for the stadium owners. Many years ago, a very wise colleague used her hands to show that gender equality is about the relationship between men and women. And it's not about men on top and women on the bottom. It's not about women on top and men on the bottom. It's not about a conflict between men or women. But if we are aiming at gender equality, we're looking at the interrelationship and the equality between women and men. Let's look at the strategies that are used to promote gender equality. This is a framework that we've developed at Gender at Work that we found is quite robust. It's based on a theory by an American named Ken Wilber. And it has two axes, the individual to collective or systemic, and the left side is informal while the right side is formal. And we use this 2x2 to look at interventions in 4 areas. And I'm going to give you examples of how we've tried to promote gender equality by intervening within those quadrants and what the results have been. This framework is based on an analysis of the role of social institutions. And it's a fractal type of analysis. In essence, you can apply it to a community, you can apply it to an organization, or you can apply it to an institution. It's the same framework. It works in slightly different ways, and we use it in Gender at Work at all of these levels because, like fractals, it maintains some of the same characteristics at every level. All right, well, let's talk about how it works. In the early 1970s, many of the so-called women in development strategies were aimed at the upper left quadrant, at consciousness and capabilities of women, teaching individual women how to be better wives and mothers through the promotion of nutrition, health, and family planning intervention. The success of these interventions was limited because they didn't change the economic circumstances of women and their families. As one Thai colleague said to me, what's the use of teaching women how to cook chicken if the only source of animal protein they have is frogs? And family planning measures that didn't include men or didn't gain women's full and informed consent risked failure and sometimes inflicted harm. So the first series of efforts to influence individual consciousness and capabilities were often directed at women, often very limited in impact. And in the 1980s, there were 2 major shifts. And one was brought about by a gender analysis framework that was developed in 3 different places, more or less similar frameworks, developed at Harvard by Anderson, Overholt, Cloud, and Austin, at the London School of Economics by Carolyn Moser and Karen Levy, and in Africa by Sarah Longway. And basically, these frameworks said, we need to look at who does what. both productive, reproductive, and community work, men, women, age, and sometimes other categories like ethnicity or religion. Who has access to and who controls resources? And resources included money, technology, knowledge. Who has access to and controls the benefits? And benefits were considered things like assets, money, leisure, influence. And what do we need to change? So you can see that if that framework had existed before they designed that West Africa irrigated rice project, it could have been very influential in terms of designing a project that better met the needs of both women and men. The second thing was that people recognized for change efforts to be successful, it was important to consider how men's interests were affected and why and how they would also benefit from greater gender equality. And this second shift was called a shift from a women in development approach to a gender in development approach, and it's inherent in these frameworks. So you can't really use these frameworks without thinking about that. And one way this new understanding was expressed was through greater investment in women's cooperatives. And there were a number of very large and successful women's cooperatives in the, particularly in the 80s. This is one from India, Lijat Papad. If I go to my neighborhood grocery store in Ottawa, I can buy Lijat Papads, which gives you an idea of how big it is. The União General, the UGC, the General Cooperative in Maputo, which supplied all of Maputo with animal protein during the insurgency of the 1990s, the India dairy cooperatives, and so on. So a number of these were very successful because they allowed women to keep some of the benefits of their increased productivity and use it to benefit their families. But these efforts were often still focused on the intended beneficiaries of development, not on the organizations that promoted it. Or on, did I skip a slide? All right. So the question about the frameworks is that they were still pretty mechanistic. They were still clockwork oriented. They were project oriented. They had a heavy focus on economics, and they were not really implicating ideas about complexity and change related to complexity. And with the 1990s came a shift in attention to organizations. So this is the same framework, but looking at it from an organizational perspective. So there you would look at what the qualities of the staff, the kinds of resources that were available for gender equality, are there policies and rules, and what are the informal norms and exclusionary practices. If governments and aid organizations, the focus said in the 90s, were insufficiently attentive to women's rights and gender equality, there was a need to develop policies and procedures to change that. So this was generally adopted in 1995 at the Beijing conference and led to some major investments to some extent in the upper right quadrant, but particularly in the lower right quadrant in policies and programs to promote gender equality. And AWARE would be an example of those types of programs. Another example of those types of programs was the legislation in India that enforced a 30% quota rule of women in local government. And that's a very interesting example because recent evaluations have shown that legal investment actually made a difference. In the beginning, the women who were appointed to the local governments tended to be the wives of the local officials, and to vote only in the way that their husbands told them. But over time, over 30 years, that has changed. And you now see that panchayats are investing much more, for example, in health and education than they used to, as women have found their voice and found ways to express their interests. When you look overall, though, at efforts on the right-hand side of the quadrant and in the top left, they had less success than one might have hoped. And we have to ask why. And increasingly, the area of social norms has come under scrutiny. This lower left quadrant, which refers to culture in a societal or organizational sense, again, it's like fractals, is a growing area of interest. The World Bank put out a major paper last year that was authored by Hillary Clinton, or it had her name on it, which was promoting a more intensive look at social norms. This is an area of interest a growing area of interest for Gates and others. It's been an important area of focus for gender at work since the early 1990s. So I will talk briefly about what we've learned about gender equality in culture, and then invite you to help identify its characteristics. Culture is to us as water is to fish. It's an invisible medium that we experience, but we don't see it. We take it for granted. And there's a whole body of work, of research on unconscious bias, which is that we see what we expect to see. And I would really like to draw this area of work to your attention. And we ignore what is unexpected, or we say, well, that's an exception to the rule. So for example, pilots in flight simulators often don't see, when they are simulating a landing, they often don't see a plane that's on the runway that they're planning to land on, because they don't expect to see it. There's a very famous video which asks you to count the number of times a ball is passed between players. And half, or slightly over half, of the people who see this video get so focused on counting the players that they don't see the person in a gorilla suit who crosses the camera screen, right? We don't expect to see it. We don't notice it. And this kind of unconscious bias is very, very prevalent particularly in international development work. In order to see our culture, it helps to enter a different one. But unfortunately, because of this unconscious bias, we tend to instantly judge another's culture and values and practices by the yardstick of our own culture. All right? This may account for development practitioners who don't see the agricultural work that women do in another culture and therefore ignore it. And even more importantly, through the imposition of the values of dominant or colonial cultures, the local mechanisms that permitted the negotiation of power relations or gender roles often atrophied as colonial values became dominant. And a good example of that would be the gender-balanced governance systems of the Iroquois Confederacy. They were the model for the American balance of power in government. But one important detail, which was gender balance in the Confederacy, got ignored, right? The people who were looking at it didn't see that women in Iroquois cultures had a major balancing power in making decisions to men. Another example would be in West Africa, which has a very strong tradition of age cohort organizations. So if you belong to the young men of your age group or the young women of your age group, you have both the right and the responsibility to organize to advance your interests. So there are examples. For example, there's a very famous women's strike in Nigeria in the early 1900s against, in this case, the British colonial powers, because they had refused to let the women bring their goods to market. Today, those organizations and their political power it's very hard to discern. It's very hard to discern. It's been almost obliterated by the imposition or the dominance of colonial cultures. So what do we do about this kind of unconscious bias? It is possible to make culture visible and to decide what needs to change, and indeed to change it. As I made the point in the beginning, culture is always changing. It's just not, it's not so often that we have a way to make that happen consciously. One of the people who has been very good at this is a woman named Dr. Wanjiku Kabira of the University of Nairobi. She's an ethnolinguist, and she has done this type of work through her exploration of traditional folk stories. She engages with communities to analyze traditional folk stories and say, what are they trying to tell us here? Is this still relevant? Is this the kind of society we want to see in the future? And if not, how do we go about changing it? A second example is a man named Robert Keegan, who's at Harvard in the Faculty of Education. He and his colleagues have also developed methodologies that help both individuals and organizations to see their patterns of behavior and change them. And Gender at Work has been doing this type of work since we sort of fell into it in the early 1990s with BRAC in Bangladesh, which we call action learning, and it's exactly the same process. These methodologies, Wanjiku's and Robert Keegan's and ours, have their roots in three areas. One is Freirean pedagogy, Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian adult educator. Process consulting, which is a type of organizational change consulting that involves people in the organization in analyzing and determining the kind of change they want to see. And in psychological theory, partly the work of the people who did the subconscious influence, but also others, especially around cognitive behavioral therapy. And essentially, this type of process engages people in examining the social norms, as well as the blockages in the other three quadrants, and look at what needs to change, try planning how to change it, and then looking to say, is this working or not, or what else do we need to do? I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then we'll have 10 minutes left, of how this works in practice. There was one, Gender at Work did a major piece of work in Somalia, former Somalia, with NGOs to try and strengthen them organizationally. And in one of these sessions, there was quite a large Somali NGO, which had just hired a brand new woman engineer as a program manager. She was very good. And the executive director, the assistant director, and this woman came to the workshop. And it pretty quickly became obvious that the executive director and the deputy were sitting together at meals, and the woman was off by herself, alone at another table in a corner. And people said, you know, we've noticed this. Do you think this is, you know, what do you think this tells you, and is this what you want? And the executive director said, well, you know, in my culture, I am not to be seen alone, especially not eating with a woman who is not a member of my family. And the response was, yes, well, you just lost one female program manager, and it probably won't be long before you lose another. So what do you think might be possible in this situation? So he said, let me think about it. So he went home and he talked to his wife about this situation, and he said, okay, well, we're going to have morning coffee together, all the staff, you know, the management team. And so it won't be just me and her, right? It'll be more, and we'll see what happens. So they began to try this, and sure enough, you know, as soon as the woman program manager began getting more information about what was changing, what needed to be done, what the priorities were, she was much better able to both offer suggestions and implement her own work program. That's one example. A second example, which is a more radical example, came from an organization called JAWS in South Africa. JAWS stands for Justice and Women. And it was an organization that supported women who were engaged with the legal system, often on matters of domestic violence, but not exclusively. And when JAWS looked at its own culture, it found that they were really reproducing women as victims. They were saying, oh, you poor thing, you know, let us accompany you to the courtroom. And in their own interactions, many of the staff who had been also victims of injustice and violence in the court system, which was why they'd set up the organization in the first place, replicated those relations of victim and victimizer. And they said, this has got to stop. In the end, they changed to becoming a very, very different organization. I mean, they, both in terms of the employees themselves and their behavior with each other, but also in the kind of services that they provided. Third example I want to give you is from BRAC in Bangladesh, which was health workers, where we did quite a long multi-year intervention to help BRAC think more about gender equality. Because while BRAC is a very large NGO that offers agricultural, health, and economic support to poor families. While they were trying to hire more women, they were losing women too, very fast. And the situation in Bangladesh at the time was not very conducive to supporting gender equality of any kind. So one of the things that happened in BRAC was that the focus on the problems women were facing tied in, very purposely actually, with problems that men's staff also were facing around supervisors who were abusive, around really unreasonable working hours. Like if you were with BRAC, you were with BRAC for life. And if you wanted to get permission to go see your new baby that your wife had just delivered, you'd be lucky if you could get it. Never mind if you were the wife who was trying to deliver the baby and get time off. So when people looked at those aspects of the culture, because the management was interested in changing this situation, they were able to make very good progress, very fast, in terms of retaining women, giving them more responsibility, strengthening and improving working conditions for both men and women, and enabling more problem solving to take place at the district office level rather than having to go back up to headquarters and down. So those are 3 examples, and there would be many more. And I am very aware that we don't have much time left. What I wanted to do was to ask you to think about here and think about some examples of how the culture here on campus, supports or prevents women and men from contributing equally. What I wanted to do was to have you do this in small groups and report back, and we would collect it all. Time is not going to permit that. So I really would appreciate it very much if you would think about this and send me any thoughts that you have to that web address. And you get a prize if you actually copy it down correctly. But the presentation will be available on the website after the talk, so you can see it again. And the reason I ask this is because, in fact, this might be an area that the program is interested in working on in the coming months and years. And if so, then we can't fix it if we don't know what the issues are, and who better to know what the cultural issues are than the people who are in the culture. So think about it. Okay, and with that, I'll stop. And if you have questions or comments, we do have a few minutes left.